There is a number that Ghana rarely talks about in public. Not the GDP figure that gets quoted at summits. Not the export total printed in annual reports. The number I am referring to is quieter than that. It lives inside the gap between what the ground produces and what the people who live above it actually receive. Ghana sits on some of the most valuable gold deposits on the African continent. It has been mining that gold commercially for well over a century. And yet, if you drive through the communities surrounding the major extraction zones in the western region, you will find something that does not match the headline. You will find dust roads, inadequate clinics, schools that run out of textbooks before the term ends, and young people who have watched the machinery roll past their homes, their entire lives, without once stopping to leave something permanent behind. That gap is not an accident. It is a system. And understanding that system is the only way to understand why Ghana's gold story keeps getting told without an ending that belongs to Ghana. Let us start with the scale, because the scale matters. Ghana is consistently ranked among the top 10 gold-producing countries in the world. In recent years, it has competed with South Africa for the title of the continent's largest producer. The gold that leaves Ghanaian soil every year is worth billions of dollars. The Ashanti region alone has produced more than 50 million ounces of gold over the past century. That is not a metaphor. That is not a talking point. That is a documented, extracted, physically removed quantity of one of the most valuable substances on Earth. And the country that it came from still carries a debt burden, still negotiates with multilateral lenders on terms it rarely sets itself, and still watches its most talented young professionals emigrate in search of economic stability that their homeland, despite all its underground wealth, has not been able to consistently provide. So the question this documentary is actually asking is not whether Ghana has gold. Everyone already knows Ghana has gold. The question is who that gold is working for. Because gold does not move on its own. It does not write its own contracts. It does not choose its own destination. It moves through structures, agreements, legal frameworks that were often written during an era when Ghana had very little power over the terms, and which have been renegotiated so incrementally since independence that the fundamental architecture has stayed largely intact. You can change the name at the top of a document without changing what the document does. And that is a lesson that matters every time a new mining agreement is celebrated in Accra as a breakthrough for the nation. To understand how this works, you have to go back to a specific period. Not to independence in 1957, though that moment carries enormous weight. You have to go to the decades that followed, when the structural conditions for extraction were not dismantled, but instead repackaged. When Ghana was a new nation, it inherited a mining sector that had been built by and for colonial economic interests. The concessions, the infrastructure, the operational logic of those mines, all of it was designed to move value outward. After independence, the aspiration was to reclaim that value. Kwame Nkrumah understood that political independence without economic independence was not full freedom. He said it in ways that were clear enough that the world still quotes him. But the structures he was trying to dismantle had deep roots, and the pressures that eventually forced Ghana toward foreign capital on unfavorable terms were not simply the result of mismanagement. They were the result of a global economic architecture that consistently rewarded extraction and penalized self-determination. By the time Ghana entered a series of IMF and World Bank structural adjustment programs beginning in the early 1980s, the conditions attached to those programs had specific consequences for the mining sector. Liberalization of foreign investment, reduced royalty rates, tax incentives designed to attract multinational mining corporations. On paper, This was framed as a way to modernize the industry and generate revenue. In practice, what it generated was a sector increasingly dominated by foreign-listed companies operating under agreements that left Ghana with a minority share of the value being pulled from its own earth. The royalty rates that were locked in during that period were, by any reasonable analysis, far below what the gold was worth relative to global market prices at the time those agreements matured. And renegotiating them has been politically complicated in ways that serve a very specific set of interests, none of which are headquartered in Kumasi or Takoradi. This is where the conversation about economic sovereignty becomes not just philosophical, but technical. Because economic sovereignty is not a slogan. It is a set of specific decisions about who holds the royalty rate, who audits the production figures, who owns the refinery, and who determines where the value-added processing happens. When Ghana exports raw gold, it is exporting the least profitable form of its own resource. The refining, the certification, the branding, the financial instruments built around the finished product, all of that value creation happens somewhere else. And somewhere else is not an accident of geography. It is a policy outcome. It is what happens when the terms of your participation in the global economy were set by others. And when changing those terms requires a level of institutional courage that is difficult to sustain inside a political system that depends on external credit and goodwill to function from year to year. The mining companies operating in Ghana are not villains in a simple story. They are operating rationally inside a system that rewards them for doing exactly what they are doing. They file their taxes in jurisdictions that offer the most favorable treatment. They structure their agreements to maximize the portion of revenue that flows back to shareholders, most of whom are not Ghanaian. They lobby against royalty increases by arguing that higher rates will reduce investment, which creates a dilemma for any government that needs both revenue and employment in the short term. This is not conspiracy. This is the ordinary operation of corporate structure inside a global system that was not designed with Ghanaian sovereignty as a priority. Understanding that distinction is important because it changes what kind of solution actually makes sense. Now here is the tension that most headlines do not stay with long enough to examine. Ghana has, at various points, made genuine attempts to increase its share of mining revenue. There have been royalty increases. There have been debates about local content requirements. There have been proposals for state equity stakes in new mining operations. And every single time, these moves have been met with a predictable set of pressures. Investment community concern, credit rating anxiety, diplomatic friction from countries whose corporations hold significant stakes in the sector. The space for Ghanaian policymakers to actually reclaim their resource wealth is not unlimited. It is bounded by debt obligations, by the terms of existing contracts, and by a global financial system that has specific consequences for nations that move too aggressively toward resource nationalism. That is the architecture. That is the ledger that never gets read aloud at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. And then there is the land. Because the conversation about gold in Ghana is inseparable from the question of what happens to the communities directly above the ore. The displacement of farming communities to accommodate mining concessions has been documented extensively by researchers, journalists, and the communities themselves. Land that families have worked for generations is reclassified, sometimes through local chieftaincy agreements, sometimes through government concession processes, in ways that leave the original occupants with compensation that does not come close to replacing what they lost. The dust that settles over these communities is not metaphorical. It is the actual byproduct of blasting operations that fund shareholder dividends in London and Toronto and Sydney, while the people living closest to the mine cannot drink safely from the streams near their homes. That is not an abstract inequality. That is a specific, locatable, documentable consequence of how Ghana's gold is being removed from the ground. This is where the conversation about Ibrahim Traoré and what is happening in Burkina Faso becomes genuinely relevant, not as a prescription, but as a point of contrast that forces a harder question. But when Burkina Faso under Traoré moved to fundamentally restructure its relationship with foreign mining operations, the decision was controversial, contested, and politically complex. But the underlying logic was straightforward. If the resource belongs to the nation, then the nation needs to control enough of the extraction process to actually benefit from it in a meaningful and lasting way. Not through royalties set at rates negotiated a generation ago. Not through corporate social responsibility programs that build a school here and a borehole there while the core value continues to flow outward. But through actual ownership, actual revenue retention, actual decisions made by Burkinabe institutions about how the wealth of the ground gets used. Whether one agrees with the specific political context in Burkina Faso or not, the economic logic of that position is not fringe. It is what every serious analysis of resource-rich developing countries eventually arrives at. The question of economic sovereignty is not whether foreign investment has a role. Of course it can. Capital, technology, and technical expertise are all things that can be sourced externally and still serve a national interest if the terms are right. The question is whether the terms reflect the actual value of what is being taken. And in Ghana's case, across decades of documented production, the honest answer is that they often have not. There is something specific that happens in a country when its people stop believing that the national wealth has anything to do with their daily lives. You can see it in the way young Ghanaians talk about opportunity. The extraordinary human capital that the country produces, engineers, doctors, economists, legal minds, continues to emigrate at rates that represent a second form of extraction. Not gold this time, but intellect. Not ore, but potential. And the connection between these two forms of loss is direct. When a country cannot retain the full value of its physical resources, it also struggles to build the public institutions, the universities, the research infrastructure, the healthcare systems that would give its best minds a reason to stay. The extraction of gold and the emigration of talent are not parallel stories. They are the same story told in two different registers. There is a figure that people in this space sometimes use to anchor the conversation, and it is worth sitting with it for a moment. Ghana has been mining gold commercially since the late 19th century. If you were to calculate the total value of gold extracted from Ghanaian soil over that entire period, adjusted for the price of gold at the time of each extraction, the number is staggering. It runs into hundreds of billions of dollars. Ghana's current GDP is roughly $150 billion. The country's external debt as of recent years has been a significant share of GDP, at points exceeding levels that triggered formal debt restructuring conversations with creditors. The arithmetic here does not require a specialist to read. A country that has sent hundreds of billions of dollars worth of one mineral alone through its export channels over more than a century should not be in the structural position Ghana is in. That gap is not a natural disaster. It is the result of terms, and terms are made by people, and people can change them. The challenge is that changing them requires a kind of institutional coherence that is genuinely difficult to build when you are also managing debt service, managing donor relationships, managing an IMF program, and managing elections every 4 years. The incentive structure inside that system does not reward the politician who picks a 10-year fight with a mining company over royalty renegotiation. It rewards the one who cuts a ribbon, attracts an investment announcement, and keeps the credit rating stable enough to refinance the next tranche of Eurobond debt. Economic sovereignty, the real kind. The kind that Ibrahim Traoré has made a central talking point of a different kind of governance experiment, is not compatible with short-term political survival inside a debt-dependent system. That is not an excuse. That is the structural explanation for why the headlines keep fading without changing the underlying situation. Let us talk about what a different set of decisions would actually look like, not as fantasy, but as documented policy possibility. Countries that have successfully increased their share of resource revenue have generally done so through a combination of approaches. First, graduated royalty regimes that automatically increase the government's take when global commodity prices rise above certain thresholds. Ghana has experimented with elements of this, but the implementation has been inconsistent, and the rates themselves have remained below what comparable producers in other regions receive. Second, mandatory downstream processing requirements. If a significant portion of the gold must be refined inside Ghana before it can be exported, then the refining margin stays in the country. This is not a radical concept. It is standard industrial policy in countries that have successfully monetized their resource endowments. Third, meaningful state equity participation in new mining ventures, not symbolic stakes, but operational shares that give the government access to production data, pricing information, and a proportional share of profit, rather than just a royalty on declared revenue. These are not theoretical options. They are tools that other nations have used to shift the balance. The reason they have not been used consistently in Ghana is not a mystery. Every one of those policies creates friction with the investors who currently benefit from the existing structure. And in a financial environment where Ghana's access to international capital markets depends partly on its reputation as a stable, investor-friendly destination, that friction has real costs. This is the trap. And seeing the trap clearly is the beginning of thinking about how to dismantle it. There is a word that gets used often in these conversations: dependency. Ghana, like many resource-rich African nations, operates inside a dependency structure that was not designed for its benefit. The debt that makes fiscal space so narrow was accumulated under terms set by creditors who understand compound interest better than any borrower. The contracts that govern extraction were negotiated in periods when Ghana had fewer options. The currency dynamics that make imported inputs for mining operations more expensive over time, while the royalty take stays fixed in dollar terms, these are not coincidences. They are features of a system. And recognizing a system for what it is, rather than treating each manifestation of it as an isolated problem, is what the conversation about economic sovereignty is actually asking people to do. This is also why the figure of Ibrahim Traoré keeps appearing as a reference point in discussions about African resource politics, even among people who have significant reservations about the political context he operates in. It is not because the situation in Burkina Faso is a simple model that translates directly to Ghana. The histories are different, the political cultures are different, the specific resource profiles are different. It is because the underlying question he has put on the table is one that every resource-rich African nation is ultimately going to have to answer. At what point does the current arrangement stop being called partnership and start being called extraction? And what does a nation actually owe to the system that has defined its economic options versus what it owes to the people living above the ore? Ghana's democracy is real. Its institutions have genuine weight. Its civil society, its journalists, its researchers and academics produce some of the most rigorous analysis of resource governance anywhere on the continent. The country has the intellectual infrastructure to ask better questions about its gold. The gap is not knowledge, it is leverage, and leverage, in the end, is what economic sovereignty actually means. It's not the ability to nationalize everything overnight, not the rejection of all foreign capital, but the capacity to say, on the basis of genuine institutional strength and reduced debt dependency, that the terms of the next contract will be different from the terms of the last one, that the royalty rate will reflect the actual market price, that the refining will happen here, that the community above the mine will have a documented, enforceable share of what comes out of the ground beneath their feet. That is the story Ghana's gold has not yet finished telling. The headlines always cover the discovery, the investment announcement, the ribbon cutting, the export figure. They do not stay long enough to follow the value to its destination. They do not ask who is holding the account, where the net profit lands after the royalties and the tax incentives and the transfer pricing adjustments have all been applied. They do not go back to the community 5 years after the mine expands and ask whether the dust road got paved. They fade. And what they leave behind, what is always left behind after the headlines fade, is the same ground, the same gold moving outward, and the same people waiting for the arithmetic to finally add up in their direction. The ledger is real. The numbers exist. The contracts can be read by anyone with access to a public filing system and the patience to follow the money across multiple jurisdictions. What has been missing is not information. What has been missing is the collective willingness to treat the gap between what the ground produces and what the people receive as a political emergency rather than a development challenge. Because development challenges get managed, political emergencies get resolved, and the difference between those two framings determines whether, 50 years from now, the communities above Ghana's gold reserves are still waiting, or whether they are finally living inside an economy that was built for them. That is what the headlines never say when they move on. And that is exactly why this story needs to be told again, from the beginning and followed all the way to where the value actually goes.